This
Our monthly
conference
water.
will now be recorded.
Welcome to the monthly water availability task force meeting. I'm Tracy Kozloff. I'll be emceeing the meeting with my partner Ben Wade from CWCB. Megan is not here today. She's off on leave. So we've got our presenters ready to go. We don't have any announcements. I'll open up the floor to see if anybody on the call has any announcements they'd like to make for the group. Not hearing anything. I think I'd like us to go ahead and jump into our presentations. This is a month where we're lucky enough to have a presentation about the wildfire outlook for this year. And we have Phil here joining us from Public Safety. I want to let everybody know that he's traveling to the West Slope today, and so he's going to give his presentation and maybe just take a very limited number of questions before he needs to get on the road. So I'd like to have Phil get started. I'll ask those of you joining the call if you could put in the chat your name and the organization you're on the call representing. That's sort of how we'll do the roll call introductions. But otherwise, we'll turn it over to Phil. And thank you for joining us, Phil.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Phil Daniels. I'm the Deputy Chief for the Wildfire Management section of the Division of Fire Prevention and Control, which is a part of the Department of Public Safety. And frequently with state employees, we have to have two business cards just to carry all of those titles and things on who we are and who we report to. Thank you for inviting me onto this call, and we're very happy to share our view and outlook of what this upcoming fire season is going to look like. I'm going to try and share a presentation with you if I can get this to work. Let's see, Chrome tab. See if this works. All right. Can you have, there you go. I can even see it myself. Perfect. So our wildfire outlook for what we're calling fire season 2021. Once again, we're not even looking at fire seasons anymore. It's a calendar year. Historically, Colorado has had kind of a bifurcated fire season where we have some intense activity late May, June, up until July, until we hit the monsoons. And there's a pause for a bit, and then we get somewhat of a fall fire season. In the month of late August and September. But over the last few years, that's changed to where we can see catastrophic wildfire in Colorado essentially any month of the year. We've lost homes in January. We've lost homes in December. So, but as we look at this, we're going to focus on the typical summer months. So the question always comes up is, how bad is this fire season going to be? And honestly, I'll tell you in December, because we really don't know. There's a lot of factors involved, and it's very challenging to predict the severity of time, primarily due to the fuels conditions. Colorado, especially, in that 6,000 up to the 14,000 foot level to the edge of the trees. We've got a lot of dead and decadent fuels that they're ready to burn whenever. They don't absorb a lot of moisture, and they are ready to burn. Also we have to look at local weather. You can take a period of time of about 7 to 10 days and go from no fire potential to extreme fire potential, just based on the winds, the humidities, and the temperatures affecting that. And as we saw last year, the monsoon. At present or in absence of a monsoon moisture flow can really change our season. And then, of course, there's ignitions. We can have all of the fuel conditions and all of the weather conditions being prime for extreme fire behavior. But if we don't get the lightning or if we don't get the human ignition sources, we don't have fires. So that's why it's very challenging for us. So the question then comes up is, well, how do you know? How do you predict? How do you plan for what your next fires activity is going to be like? And once again, like Mark Twain's very, very good with this, and it's like we have to look to history, and it may not be exact again, but it's going to look real similar to what we've seen in the past. And so we have national trends, which is very interesting. The total number of fires is actually decreasing nationwide, but the number of acres are increasing. So fewer fires, but more acres being burned. And if you look in 2020, we had nationwide just under 60,000 fires, which is below the 5-year and the 10-year average for numbers of fires. However, we had over 10 million acres burned, which there's only been 2 other years in recorded history that have had over 10 million acres burned, and that was 2015 and 2017. Last year, we lost nationwide just under 18,000 structures. The 10-year average nationwide is about 5,000. So obviously 2020 was a very big, dramatic year for fires nationwide, and Colorado for a big chunk of that time was at the tip of the spear for that. So what do we look at in Colorado? Well, 4 of the 20th largest fires occurred in 2020. Last year, numbers 1, 2, and 3 of largest fires from which was the Cameron Peak, East Troublesome, and the Pine Gulch fires were in 2020. Also, 9 of the top 20 fires in Colorado history have occurred since 2018. So if you look at the last 3 years, big fires again, a lot more of them. And since 2012, 15 of the top 20. And all of the top 20 have occurred since 2001. So we're seeing larger fires. We're seeing more destructive fire seasons than we've historically seen. So, well, what does that mean overall? And it means that history is telling us we're probably going to have a big, busy fire season, but also realizing that with local conditions, presence or absence of a monsoon, and then also ignitions can really change. So we work regionally with our federal land management partners, as well as the state of Wyoming, state of South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, as a for prediction and also for response. Wyoming's having a bad year, we help them, and vice versa. And one of the things that they provide to us regionally is a outlook. And so for the next 4 slides, I'm going to show you kind of for the next 120 days what we're anticipating based on fuel condition, based on predicted weather, and so on, what we're looking at. It's very difficult to predict past 120 days. And in fact, the accuracy, even after 30 days, really kind of degrades just due to changes in weather patterns, et cetera. So as we look at the month we're currently in April, and this seems to trend out reliably with what we've actually seen on the ground. Southeast Colorado, this area right in here, probably an above normal large fire potential. We've also seen South Dakota, North Dakota, and then places obviously in Southeast Kansas where there is a abnormal or above normal large fire potential. Moving into the next few months, we look at May. That persists down in southeast Colorado, but we're also seeing we're currently seeing, like today, it is red flag in southwest Colorado near Cortez. Then it's showing that in the San Juans and below, towards the Arizona, Utah, Four Corners area. That we're starting to see that large fire potential increase there. Moving into June, essentially everything in Colorado south of Highway 50 is showing that above normal large fire potential. And then into July, it's the western slope, northwestern Colorado. All of those areas are what we're predicting to be higher large fire potential. Now, with the caveat with all of this can change. Okay, things can change, weather patterns can change, but this is what we're anticipating. So the real key that we ask about is the monsoon. Last year at this time, we were predicting roughly a normal fire season, essentially what you're seeing now with our predictions. But we didn't get a monsoon really to speak of. There wasn't a lot of moisture brought into the state from the tropics, so we had a really busy July, August, and September. And that potentially could occur again this year. If we get a strong monsoon, could shut down the second half of the fire season, and we won't have fires. But if there is no monsoon, we can anticipate a similar year to last year. And that is all that I have to show you. My crystal ball seems to be broken to give you a real solid guess. If you have questions, please ask them at this time.
Any questions for Phil? Long, awkward pause. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for giving the report, and travel safe today.
All right. Thank you very much. My contact information is on there if people do have any questions. Otherwise, have a good meeting, and we'll chat with you in a year to do it again.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think next up on our agenda, probably the Colorado Climate Center. Today we've got Peter Goebel here.
Yep. Hi there.
Hi, Peter.
Let's see. Looks like I had to ask if I can share my screen.
Peter, hang on, hang on 1 second here.
Yeah, no problem.
My computer likes to be slow, and then here we go. All right, controls coming your way here.
Okay. Yep. And I should be sharing. Are you seeing my first slide?
I see it. That's good,
Awesome.
Peter.
Well, good to be with you today on this chilly April morning. I guess I'll dive in, and the agenda will look like it often does with our Climate Center updates. We'll talk about some of our seasonal temperature and precipitation conditions. I'll talk a little bit about surface condition response, although a lot of that will be left to NRCS. We'll go into some details on the forecast for the next few months. I'll try not to be too redundant. I'll be saying some of the same things that Phil said, but then we'll go into a summary and we can proceed from there. All right, so I'm going to start with maybe my most boring slide of the whole presentation, our March 2021 temperature rankings. And you can see that March was a pretty normal month for all of eastern Colorado, March worked out to very near normal temperatures. On the west slopes, we do see a modest tilt towards above normal temperatures, but it was a fairly normal month from a historical perspective. This slide is showing departure from normal temperatures for the first half of April. And we started April warm. You might have fond memory of celebrating Easter weekend in the 80s with warm temperatures across much of the state. Things have certainly taken a turn. As I look outside, I'm looking at snow and cold, and I'm sure many of you are as well. And if we were to include these next 5 days on top of the first half of the month, a lot of the eastern side of the divide, particularly the northeast corner of the state, would actually go below average, whereas the southwest corner of the state would still certainly be above average. And we've seen quite a bit of that over the last few months, where we plunge into cold air east of the divide, but they don't really get it west of the continental divide, at least not to the same extent. This graphic is showing yesterday's low temperatures from the coagment network ending at midnight. This was the most recent I could pull, and you're seeing these are basically the midnight temperatures is what you're seeing after the cold front came through. A lot of 20s and even teens, and things got even colder afterwards. We got down to 11 degrees this morning in Fort Collins. Fairly similar lows across much of the urban corridor. So well below normal temperatures for this time of year. All right, here is how we've fared temperature-wise for the water year to date. So October, well, not quite to date. This is just through the end of March. We'll get you those April statistics next time. But here we're looking at, again, October through March of the water year 2021. And you can see, as I discussed a couple slides ago, that we have this east to west gradient in temperature conditions so far this water year, with much of the urban corridor and front range kind of in that normal temperature range. The eastern plains in the bottom third of the distribution, not on the extreme side, bottom 10 percentile or record coldest, just the bottom third, and then much of the west slopes in the above normal or top third. So when our cold fronts have come through over the past 6 months, a lot of them have really come off of the Canadian shield and plunged down east of the continental divide. The mountains have shielded the west slopes from a lot of the coldest air that we've gotten. We haven't seen as much of the cold air diving down from the northwest, which really gets the western slopes. All right, so that's an overview of temperature. Now we'll delve into precipitation a bit more. These are the precipitation rankings for the month of March 2021. You can see for the western slopes, it was near normal, whereas the east side of the continental divide, much of this moisture came from one storm. The second weekend of March brought some really nice moisture totals, in some cases over 3 inches to the front range, as well as some really nice moisture out on the eastern plains. Last time I was the representative from the Climate Center on this call was January, and I remember Brian from NRCS saying something about how we could really use a storm like March 2003. We got something that was close-ish to that. I mean, it's really hard to outdo March 2003, where we had 5+ inch moisture content totals up and down the front range. This March, I wouldn't describe it as like a miracle drought buster, but it was certainly magnanimous and put us in a better position than we were in before the start of the month. Again, here are some data from that snowstorm. This is an analysis from NOAA's snow risk product. and we're looking at snowfall totals up and down the Front Range of over 1.5 feet from that event. And some areas, such as up near Cameron Pass, we had as much as 4 feet of snow from that event alone. But then you can also see where the totals on the west slopes were much more modest. In some cases, they were still decent. Some places still got over a foot of snow from that event, but overall, March still worked out to near normal for that area. All right, so here we'll be looking at some quadrant charts, which Russ has recently brought into the rotation. I really like these. This is looking at how March 2021 compared to other marches across the state on record using data from the National Centers for Environmental Information. And we call them quadrant charts because they're basically slicing things into, was it warm and dry, warm and wet, cool and wet, cool and dry, and we're just inside that cool and wet quadrant for the month of March, a little bit on the cool side, well on the wet side. You can see that there's a number of marches across the state that were wetter, and a lot of these marches that were wetter would be marches that hit the west slopes much harder. One of the ones that was standing out to me was 2019, just 2 years ago. That may not have been as snowy a march for many folks who live along the urban corridor, probably less snowy than 2021, but it was much, much more snowy west of the Continental Divide, where the snow tends to hit hardest in March in normal years. So good to be in that cool and wet quadrant, but maybe not quite as far into the quadrant as you might think, depending on where you live and what you experienced. And this is just to help highlight that it's a couple more quadrant charts for different parts of Colorado. The upper left chart, which is somewhat obscured, is a quadrant chart for Climate Division 2, which is basically the entire west slopes. And they were actually just slightly in that cool and dry quadrant, pretty near normal though, one of the most near normal years on record. Whereas if we look at the Kansas drainage, or really east central Colorado out on the eastern plains, it was the 4th wettest March on record. So a big difference again from the east side to the west side of the state. Here's our April month-to-date precipitation from radar estimates, and you can see that we've plunged well back into the dry side of normal on the western slopes. Much of the area west of the Continental Divide has experienced less than 50% of normal precipitation for the month to date. The southeast corner of the state is also struggling, where we've gotten the rain and snow. Up further north, they've just gotten the wind, as those storms haven't dipped quite as far south with the moisture to this point. All right, and again, we'll zoom out to the water year through March. So this is the first half of the water year, and similar to temperature, we see an east to west gradient in terms of precipitation. On the west slopes, we've got quite a bit of area that's actually in the much below normal or bottom 10 percentile. And the station data that we'll look at in just a minute, I would say looks considerably worse than the gridded data on the west slopes. I think that that's something for our office to look into, why there's a bit of a discrepancy there. But as bad as these percentiles are on the west slopes, like I said, the station data I'll show you in just a minute is actually worse than that. If we look east of the Continental Divide, we see conditions either near normal or just sneaking into that top third of the historical ranking, up and down the urban corridor. Just a little bit of below normal mixed in there, but those tend to be the anomalies east of the Continental Divide. So, you know, we were all hot and dry last summer, but at least the eastern side of the state has had a decent reset since that point. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and look at some station data for the water year to date, and we're going to look at things based on climate regions, which were designed by Klaus Wolter, and sort of based on which parts of Colorado experience similar temperature and precipitation patterns by year. We'll start with region 1 and work our way around the horn counterclockwise. So we start with Grand Lake, and this is where, like I said, the station data here seems to be looking worse than the gridded data, where we're seeing the 3rd driest on record with data since 1906 for Grand Lake. Only 48% of average to start the water year. Steamboat Springs has also been well on the dry side of average. Looks like we did better in early February, but we've certainly been on the dry side of normal recently. All right, Grand Junction, Walker Field, again, well on the dry side of average. Looks like just 51% of average. And then Montrose got some decent moisture in mid-February, 82% of average, still on the drier side of average. Mesa Verde National Park, okay moisture in both mid-February and mid-March, but things have been bone dry over the last month or so, so they're really in need of a good storm. Only 59% of average for the water year to date. And as we can see from these gray traces looking forward, if you were to plug in most of the historical years from this point onward, we would be below average through the water year. The Bregman Field area, or the whole San Luis Valley, is one of the parts of the state that has fared better throughout much of the water year to date. A nice bump in late October from some good early season snow, and since then we've tracked a little bit below average, but we're still at 94% of average now, and much of the wet season is still to come here, so you can see that if we project things forward, still a good chance of having an average water year in the San Luis Valley area, which is certainly encouraging to see. San Luis Valley has run below normal in a lot of years recently. Colorado Springs has sort of slowly climbed out of early deficits in January, February, March, and is now right at average, or 104% of average. But as we transition onto the Eastern Plains, we're going to see that the wet season is still to come. And I think that's actually a really important point to drive home, is that the west slopes, the wet season is more centered around the first half of the water year. So the west slopes being dry is perhaps more concerning than the east slopes being wet is good, if that makes sense. In a normal year, we would expect that the majority of the precipitation is still in front of us for the Eastern Plains. So if we don't get that, early surpluses can vanish in a hurry. Walsh in southeast Colorado, we were right about at normal after March snow, but then we've fallen behind in the last 30 days. I think I showed a graphic a couple slides ago, the AHAPS graphic, that showed that southeast Colorado has been quite dry for the month of April to date. And then if we go to the northeast quadrant of the state in Akron, you can see a really nice bump getting us back above average that second week of March when the snow hit, and then dry again until last week, and we're just staying above average at 106%, but the next couple months will be really critical. Boulder, again, great snow to bring us back to average in March, and then some decent moisture recently. We're a little bit behind. Next couple months will be interesting. All right, now we'll move into some graphics showing standardized precipitation index around the state. and these are color coded. The dry side of these is color coded to match up with the US drought monitor map, so we can think about these dots roughly matching, say, D0 equivalent here in South Boulder County, D1 equivalent, and so on and so forth down to D4. The 30-day SPI no longer includes that mid-March snowstorm, so we're a bit on the dry side, although across much of the eastern portion of the state, you can see near normal conditions. 90-day very much includes the March moisture, and we see that we are doing well over the last 90 days in the northeast quadrant of the state, running a little bit behind on the west slopes. But here's where we're going to see that our drought remaining in Colorado is very much a long-term drought. I'm going to skip right over to the 12-month standardized precipitation index, where things take a big turn, and we see much of the northwest quadrant of the state in the D4 range, in many cases driest year on record over the last 12 months. And then the eastern plains still on the dry side of average, even though the last 6 months have been good. What this really tells you is just how bad last summer and early fall were. One thing that's encouraging about that from a standpoint of analyzing standardized precipitation index is because last summer was so bad, as we move forward into the warm season, these basically have nowhere to go but up, where it would take another abysmal season to keep them in the gutters, but our SPIs would have to bounce up if we have a decent or even halfway decent summer. Whether or not that would alleviate things from an impact standpoint is a different question altogether, but from just analyzing SPI, we can expect things to probably trend upwards. Now we're going to look at some soil moisture model data. So this is looking at just the top 10 centimeters of soil moisture data ending about a week ago. You can see over the most near surface layer of soil, most places still on the dry side of average. Again, the colors here are designed to match the US drought monitor. So anywhere not gray on this map is below the 30th percentile, and anywhere in red or dark red is 5th percentile or worse. But overall, the top 10 centimeter conditions look better than if you look at the soil deep or top meter conditions, where we see a number of places in the dark red, which represents below the 2nd percentile. A lot of that area is over the high terrain where the snow has yet to melt. And so we would expect to see these conditions improve somewhat as the snow melts, but it's important to note that those antecedent dry soil conditions are going to rob us of some of the moisture that would have otherwise gone into runoff and stream flow. As the snow melts, it's got to kind of take care of the soil profile first. So for that reason, we're expecting runoff, particularly on the west slopes, not to be as efficient as normal. Here is the vegetation drought response index, which is computed by satellite, looking at basically what wavelength the vegetation is reflecting versus absorbing. And when the vegetation is more efficiently absorbing near infrared wavelengths, that's an indication that it's healthier. When it's not, it's a good indication that it's dry. And as we're seeing things come into season again, we're seeing the west slopes showing a lot of moderate and severe drought on the veg dry index, and then the eastern plains still on the dry side of normal despite the recent moisture, largely owing to the conditions that we experienced last summer and fall. So that's key right now, is antecedent conditions are not on our side as we this next warm season or growing season. Here's the current US drought monitor. It has improved some over recent weeks, but we still see a lot of severe to exceptional drought on the western slopes. East of the Continental Divide, it's a bit more of a mix, but we still haven't cleared any part of the state from the drought classification system entirely. A couple areas now showing up as D0 or abnormally dry, which is not technically drought. So we're not 100% in drought, but we're still 100% represented on the US Drought Monitor map. Here's how things have changed just over the last month. So this last month would not include the changes that occurred just from the blizzard we had in the second week of March, but conditions since then. And I think that one of these assessments actually was kind of a reanalysis after that snowstorm, where it took us a couple weeks to really get a handle on how much things had improved. So even though the snowstorm wasn't in the last month, it probably does affect this map. But you can see things have improved slightly across pockets of the east side of the state over the last month. And then if we look at the last year, you really see that that's outdone by just how much the drought ramped up over last summer. So again, this is looking at how many classes we've either improved or degraded from 1 year ago at this time. You see a couple pockets where we've improved slightly, but for the most part, you just see degradations, certainly across the northwest quadrant of the state, as well as much of the northern half of the state. All right, moving into the seasonal outlook now. We're about to begin the month of May, and with that in mind, I like to show these proportion precipitation maps. Basically, the areas shaded in the green or blue-green are areas where May is an important month for precipitation, or we receive a larger contribution of our annual precipitation from May than an average month, and the areas in brown are areas where May is on the climatologically dry side of things. I think that this is important to show in that it would take an outstanding May to really turn things around in western Colorado, because it's especially southwest Colorado, because it tends to be part of the dry season. So we've already kind of dug our hole, and it's really hard to get out in the dry season. Whereas on the eastern plains, May tends to be an important month. So what happens over the next 30, 40 days is going to tell us a lot about how the season will go, particularly from an agricultural standpoint. I apologize, this is supposed to be playing a loop, but what I wanted to show was how temperature conditions were changing across the sea surface of the equatorial Pacific, particularly the eastern equatorial Pacific. We know this is what drives the ENSO oscillation, or determines whether we're in El Nino, La Nina, and is important to overall precipitation patterns in the US. La Nina has actually been weakening or waning over the last couple months. We're moving back towards neutral conditions, although climate models are hinting at the development of a second-year La Nina in fall and next winter. Here is kind of the suite of models, how things shake out over the coming months. So for the May, June, July season, neutral conditions are favored, although we may hang on to weak La Nina. Throughout the summer, neutral conditions tend to be favored. That's often the case. We often see ENSO sort of break down over the summer months. But then, like I was saying, as we get into the fall, we tend to see a slight tilt towards La Nina being favored. And then, of course, in the near term, temperatures will be cold. So this is a map of forecasted temperatures as well as departure from normal temperatures. For tomorrow morning, we have kind of a cold week on tap before things really warm back up this weekend. And then if we look at CPC's May outlook, we see increased probability of above normal temperatures across the entire state, and a slight tilt towards below normal precip, although they did get rid of that tilt in northern Colorado, which is good to see. A lot of this is based on trend, where you tend to see in these CPC maps an increased tilt towards above normal temperatures, barring some additional information that would suggest otherwise. That's particularly true as we get into the summer months, because the summer months are less variable from year to year. But there's also dynamical model input as well, and it seems that storms that we get in particularly the first half of May are likely to track a little farther north, which would be less favorable for cool temperatures and moisture in the southern part of the state. Like I mentioned, La Nina is sort of breaking down, but the warmer and drier than normal in May in the southern half of the state is consistent with what we might expect from a La Nina year. Here is our May through July outlook. Like I said, a lot of this is, again, based on trend, and the more you get into the summer, the more CPC tends to load heavily on above normal temperature conditions being favored. Those 30-year climate normals from 1981 through 2010 that they're validating against are getting a little bit long in the teeth, and given the temperature trend, particularly over summer, that we're seeing, it's likely that we'll be on the high side of normal. Furthermore, some of the dynamical model input that goes into these CPC forecasts seems to indicate that we'll see some anomalous high pressure ridging, particularly over the northwest quadrant of the US, that could affect some of the precipitation patterns that we see over the summer. A lot of uncertainty, particularly once we get into July and we get into monsoon season. Things really become more of a toss-up, but a tilt towards below normal precipitation, especially as we enter the first half of summer, largely driven by what some of the dynamical models are showing.
Thank you.
And then this is just moving forward
Peter?
into June through August.
Peter, this is Tracy.
Hi, Tracy.
Can I just, hi, I'm sorry if I missed it, but do you know
You
if, I'm here, sorry, I had some background noise, so I muted myself again.
Okay.
Do you know, will they be shifting forward the 30-year normals they're comparing to go through 2020 at some point? And would that make a difference?
You know, I would think they have to. I think that CPC, the normals update process is still underway, and I think that's why CPC is still hanging on to 81 through 2010 for now. My latest updates on when the official 91 through 2020 normals will be out is early summer. So I don't know if the CPC will switch to the new normals right away, or if they'll wait until, say, the start of next calendar year or water year. But if next April we're still looking at CPC forecasts that are being validated against the 1981 through 2010 normals, I'd be very surprised.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you bet. All right, so June through August, not a huge difference from the May through July. You start to see some above normal or increased chances of above normal moisture work their way into the forecast in southern Arizona. Maybe that's indicative of a good monsoon. CPC's had major problems with the monsoon in recent years, so I would not hang my hat on that. Similar to what Phil said, we're going to be kind of waiting with bated breath to see what that does, because it has huge implications for our ongoing ecological drought and for our fire season. And to go along with that, our seasonal drought outlook from the Climate Prediction Center has drought likely to persist in Colorado throughout the next few months. Like I said, areas that are just D0 or abnormally dry aren't technically considered drought, but in the area, the pockets of Colorado that we have D0, the seasonal drought outlook is going with drought development likely. Yeah, we'll see how that plays out with their, given their forecast. I'd say that's consistent with their forecast, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of these areas, particularly in north and northeast Colorado, don't necessarily go right back to drought. All right, you're going to see a lot more of this from NRCS, so I'll just kind of gloss over this, but this is where things peaked in terms of snowpack over the cold season. We see we had a good year in the Sangre de Cristos, a little bit on the dry side of normal across much of the western slopes. Generally, the further west you go, the lower the percent of normal water year peak. I didn't really show this to steal anyone's thunder. I just want to say that these numbers in a vacuum wouldn't be terrible, but when you pile them on top of the antecedent conditions we had going into this season and the fact that we expect runoff to be inefficient, they really do put us in a bind. And we'll see more forecast information from NRCS, so I'll kind of skip over this too. But the streamflow outlook is not good on the west slopes, with the combination of, you know, above normal temperatures being forecast, as well as below normal snowpack, and those brutally low antecedent soil conditions, as well as low base flows. Stream flows to start the year are not necessarily invigorating. And then this is just going along with what Phil was showing, that, you know, given the forecast and given the conditions we have going into this season, there's definitely concern for the fire season, particularly on the west slopes. But also, as Phil says, there's a lot of uncertainty there. So we'll see. Here are some of my main takeaways. March was a great month for eastern Colorado. The snow wasn't heavy enough or widespread enough for me to call it a miracle March, but I'm happy calling it a magnanimous March. It certainly put us in a better position than we were in. The start of April already undid some of that progress, particularly on the western side of the Continental Divide. Long-term conditions are still well on the dry side of normal. So from a hydrologic and ecological drought standpoint, we're still in the thick of it. And this is reflected in soils, plant stress, surface water. Snowmelt in western Colorado started to come quite early. Early snowmelt is often indicative of a worse fire season. There has been a bit of a pause with this cooler weather, so we'll see what happens going forward. Yeah, summers are getting hotter, and the current seasonal forecast is very much consistent with that. But then some of the other inputs that go into the model indicate that there could be abnormally dry conditions that affect Colorado, particularly north and west Colorado. And then the coming season will likely bring us above normal risk of fires and water shortages, particularly in western Colorado. Another way I thought of to illustrate this, we've gotten used to looking at levels of concern. And so I've kind of anecdotally appraised my level of concern for different common disastrous drought impacts in Colorado. Fire season, my level of concern is certainly high with everything we've seen so far. Western slopes, water availability, again, as the more long-term this drought gets, the higher my concern gets. Eastern Plains agriculture, I wasn't quite sure where to put this. I went above normal just based on the fact that soils are still on the dry side of normal, particularly in southeast Colorado, but it's a lot of that is really going to fall on these next 6 weeks and what happens in terms of precipitation. Front range water availability, I think that's one of the areas we're in a bit better shape, where the reservoirs that the front range draws off of, I think, are in better shape than a lot of other reservoirs across the region, and we've had better precipitation than a lot of the state recently. So that's all I've got for you. thanks for listening. And if there's any questions, comments, concerns, I'm happy to field those.
Thank you, Peter. Any questions for Peter?
I'll go ahead and relinquish my screen sharing.
Peter, I just wanted to, this is Swithin, I just wanted to say I like coining the term magnanimous March, the books.
Sorry, I maybe lost you after Magnanimous March there.
I think that'll go in the books of the lexicon for these forecasts, just like Miracle May.
Oh, cool. Yeah, hope so.
Peter legacy.
Hey, folks, let's just give another minute or so for questions for Peter. And also, if you have not yet put in the chat your name and who you're on the call representing, please do that. That'll help us with our roundtable coming up later. One more chance to ask Peter a question. All right. Without further ado, why don't we shift over to NRCS and Brian DeMoncos. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. Peter, as always, a spectacular presentation. I really like your levels of concern slide. I thought that was a really good summary. And as I've been saying in all the media interviews that I've been doing over the last, or that we've been doing in Snow Survey over the last 2 months, we always think that it's worth reiterating the very dry antecedent conditions that we're seeing right now. And how much of a role that plays in the water supply outlook we're looking at for this summer. So yeah, it's definitely worth restating. And thanks again, man. All right, if you cannot see my screen, let me know, and I'll stop. Awesome, thank you, Tracy. Okay, excuse me. All right, so diving right in, Peter, again, I got to reach back to your slide that you had there regarding peak SWE that you showed there in one of your last slides. That's a great slide. I did not put that here in map version. However, we will see it in these snowpack graphs and the traces for this water year. And for the most part, across the vast majority of the state, we have likely hit our peak snowpack. So we'll be hitting on that here throughout the basins. And there's one area where there's a chance we could see a little bit more snowpack, but I think Peter covered it's probably not too likely. Anyway, looking in the northwest corner of the state, snowpack is currently 81% of average, even after this little storm that we had here, and it was little in the area there. Snowpack peaked out at 88% of normal in the combined Yampa White and North Platte River Basin snowpack. And then here, I think I drew back to last month for this particular basin, so don't be confused. This is last month's snowpack. Last month when I presented. And then here to this month, you can see that snowpack has come down semi-considerably, specifically in the Yampa and White combined basins. Not so much in the North Platte. Precipitation in the mountains, and here specifically in the Yampa White, the combined Yampa White, for April to date was 45% of normal. March, unfortunately, was not so good. On the Front Range, we got some decent precip out of that storm, decent snow out of that March storm, the magnanimous March storm. Thank you, Peter. But unfortunately, in the Yampa White, it was not quite so beneficial. So we are looking, excuse me, mute that. So yeah, you can see we still have a lot of room for improvement here in April. This is what April should be, the amount of accumulation, which is above an inch. And here we are, I think we're below an inch to this point. Things are pretty dry. As a matter of fact, excuse me. I was going to put these in the presentation, but I didn't quite have enough time. The Yampa White precipitation for April so far is actually tied. There's a four-way tie between 1990, 2002, 2005, and this year for the second lowest precipitation accumulation in the combined Yampa White basins. And that's on a 36-year period of record. So that 45% is not very much. We're needing more. And here you can see site by site, there's been very little precipitation as of yesterday morning. As I had pointed out in previous presentations, previous water availability task force meetings, we were record low for precipitation back in early January. Late January and very early February. However, some February storms boosted things up. We got some above normal precipitation in the combined Yampa White River basins in the beginning of February, which helped us out. But you can see here that we've been flirting with that minimum pretty closely. And here April has been quite dry. Current year-to-date precipitation is 77% of normal in the combined Yampa White. And then streamflow forecast based off of April 1 data show that we're expecting streamflows below to well below normal. A few of these numbers are off just a little bit by 1 or 2%, but they're generally pretty close. And I thought it was not worth going through the rigmarole of actually updating this manually. So nonetheless, streamflow forecasts are not looking the best, particularly in the Yampa White, a little bit better in the North Platte, but still not great. And that goes again to highlight those very dry antecedent conditions, both in base stream flows and in soil moisture conditions. And then we've got below normal snowpack kind of compounding the dry conditions and resulting in low stream flows. Kind of like Peter's level of concern, what am I foreseeing for the streamflow forecast here for May 1? Provided we receive near normal precipitation from here on out through the rest of April, and we don't get big storms particularly, I'm thinking that these streamflow forecasts are going to go down even further for May 1. So something to think about. And I think that's going to be in the vast majority of the basins, with the exception of, say, the South Platte, maybe the Arkansas, maybe the very upper Colorado. But we'll get to that here in a little bit. All right, moving on into the Colorado. Speaking of, snowpack, according to this graphic, is 76% of normal in the entire upper Colorado River Basin. More than likely, we saw snowpack peak at the very beginning of April here, and it peaked at 87% of normal across the entire basin. Fortunately, the snow melt rates that we're seeing are generally somewhat normal. The reason the median and the average line are not quite so steep is because we can see these bumps in storms, and they tend to weigh on those normal lines. But seeing these rates of melts are near normal. There are some sites and some basins where we're seeing slightly above normal melt rates. Those are a little on the concerning side, not from a flood potential, but from a melting out even earlier. So yes, our snowpack here peaked about a week and a half early. And like Peter said, early snowmelt tends to not bode well for streamflow runoff. But one thing to look on the positive side is a near normal snowmelt rate. When you get those above normal snowmelt rates and you really start to melt out snow early with an even earlier snowmelt peak, that can really make for some dry conditions that Peter was alluding to earlier. In most basins, the snowmelt rates are near normal, which makes me feel pretty good. We haven't had consistent, exceptionally warm weather through day and night for multiple days on end in the mountains that would really drive above normal snowmelt rates. So there is some positive news in the conditions we're currently seeing. Spatially, SNOTEL sites are reporting, this was last month. We were looking at snowpack near normal, or a little bit below normal in the entire Colorado. However, fast forward a month and snowpack has degraded a fair amount earlier than normal, and that's what's driving the 76% of normal. Of course, if you look at the discrepancy, basically I like to view it as the distance between these lines is, well, a 76% snowpack, and then here you had a 90% snowpack. Well, it's actually back somewhere in here. So anyway, snowpack in the Colorado is 76% of normal. Month-to-date precipitation for the upper Colorado here again is 45% of normal for April, and then March was pretty much right at normal in the upper Colorado. And then here, April to date precipitation, or excuse me, I should say April to yesterday morning, you can see that some sites have received very little precipitation, on the order of several tenths of an inch of snow water equivalent, or just a few inches of snow. Year-to-date precipitation in the upper Colorado is 78% of normal. And here again, stream flows are below and bordering on well below normal. Again, I'm thinking that the lower basin, should conditions persist the way they are right now, or we receive near normal precipitation, since we're most of the way through the month, I would guess that a number of these stream flow forecast points come May 1 will have even lower predictions. Not by much, but we'll have to see what the models put out. Reservoir storage for the combined, or not for the individual reservoirs in the upper Colorado here, and then for the combined reservoirs in the basin-wide number here, bars on the far right. Fortunately, in the upper Colorado, reservoir storage is very close to normal for the combined reservoirs compared to a number of the other basins in the state. And you can see that we're nowhere near where we were in 2012, 2002, and in 2019. Okay, moving on into the South Platte. As of right now, snowpack is at 96% of normal. Snowpack, you can see here, is because of the high elevation of the mountains, the snowpack typically peaks out later in the South Platte than the rest of the state. And for that reason, a lot of the information here in the upper left is not the same as all the other graphs that we're looking at today. There's a conditional and logical set of programming that fills out what is put in here. So this is why we don't see what the snowpack peaked out at. However, if we are able to get 2 times what we typically get in terms of precipitation for the rest of the year, we could wind up reaching this snowpack peak. But really, we're doing pretty good compared to the rest of the state here in the South Platte at 96% of normal snowpack. This is yesterday's reading. Again here, 96% of normal snowpack, favoring the northern part of the basin just slightly. There is some good snowpack in the headwaters of the basin, but I would say consistently here in the central portion of the basin, snowpack is just slightly better. We have a number of sites that are a little bit below normal in the mountains there, in the headwaters of the South Platte. March precipitation was 123% of normal, and April to date is the best in the state at 64% here in the South Platte. Looking at month-to-date precipitation, spatially at all of the SNOTEL sites here, you can see that there's the vast majority are below normal. We just have not received the precipitation that we need so far in April. Precipitation year to date is 92% of normal in the South Platte. And then here, the most recent April 1 forecasts again are showing more favorable near normal conditions in the northern part of the basin, and then in the southern part of the basin, the headwaters, streamflow forecasts are just a little bit below normal. And here, like I was mentioning earlier, I think the South Platte might avoid a real dip in streamflow forecast, and might not see much of a dip at all. We'll have to see what future precipitation does. And we had the best results from the storm here this week, and this wetter period that we've seen So it's tended to help out a bit, and I think things will remain pretty close to where we were on April 1 for streamflow forecast, but we'll have to see. Here's all the reservoir storages for the reservoirs that we keep track of in our database, and then again on the right you can see the combined reservoir storage. And then looking at the long-term reservoir trend, you can see that we have come up over the last 3 months to right at normal reservoir storage in the combined South Platte reservoirs. All right, moving on into the Gunnison. Unfortunately, as is typically the case, as we move south and particularly even west in Colorado, things tend to get drier. So we're going to see things get a little bit drier, and we're going to see that snow melt has progressed a fair amount more, which is not too atypical. And speaking of how atypical it is, you can see that we peaked out here this year again on April 1st, but you can see back just last year we peaked out with snowpack just about that same time. So it's not atypical, but it is slightly abnormal. Let's put it that way. Snowpack typically peaks in the beginning of April. And here in the Gunnison, snowpack is 69% of normal, peaked out at 86% of normal. So that's actually pretty good considering where we are right now for snowpack. Most of the sites in the Gunnison are especially in the northern portion of the basin are 80% of normal, whereas we have a few sites, most of the sites actually in the southern portion of the basin are actually doing relatively well at this point for snowpack. Oh, I'm sorry, I keep doing this to myself. This was last month's graph at 87% of normal, and then here now into this month, as of yesterday, the Gunnison is 69% of normal, and still we have slightly more favorable snowpack in the southern portion of the state. March precipitation was right at normal. However, April so far has only been 25% of normal. And for the Gunnison, April precipitation to date is the second lowest in the period of record of 41 years and compares quite closely to 2002. And I forgot to mention that for the Colorado River Basin, precipitation month to date is second worst in our period of record for 41 years, and again compares with 2002. Sorry for neglecting to mention that. And then here you go, month to date, individual site observations are relatively bleak. Year to date precipitation for the Gunnison is at 72% of normal. And has been, actually I should point it out, has been quite dry. We have just a few tenths of an inch of precipitation across the entire basin. Again, here streamflow forecasts are low as of April 1. I would gander that they are probably going to go down some for the May 1 reading. And individual reservoir storage by the end of March, and then the combined on the right. You can see as of the end of April, as of the end of March, forgive me, we are still below normal for the long-term trend, but we're relatively close to where we were in the beginning of 2019, the beginning of 2017, and then you can see there's a few other times that we were this low. So it's not abnormal to be this low, but we have been this low before. Moving into the San Miguel, the combined San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, San Juan basins, snowpack peaked out on March 28th, a little bit earlier than the rest of the state, which is relatively normal because just because of it's so far south. And again, it's not too different from the normal peak snowpack. But here, I would argue that we did start to see a pretty fast melt rate here. And you can see that we got no help, or I shouldn't say no help, we got very little help out of this last week of more active weather. At least it's been more active here in the South Platte. Snowpack is now at 63% of normal, and snowpack peaked out at 85% of normal. And then here you can see many of the individual sites. Snowpack are below normal. All of them are below normal, and a fair number, especially in the western slope of the San Juans, are showing snowpack below 50% of normal. And here's a real highlight of how dry things have been in the combined San Miguel de Lourdes, San Dimas, San Juan basin. April to date precipitation has only been 14% of normal, and March was fortunately near normal, but still slightly below. And then month to date precipitation, you can see very little, and in some cases, no precipitation. Year-to-date precipitation in the combined basins is 67% of normal, and the stream flows are predicted as of April 1 to be near 50% of normal, give or take here or there, but relatively low. So it'll be interesting to see what turns up for May 1 stream flow forecasts. Reservoir storage here, unfortunately, in the combined San Miguel de Lourdes, San Dimas, San Juan basin is below normal and trending down. I'm not familiar with what the operations are and what the planning is there. I didn't include any stream flows in this presentation, but I know that they are coming up across much of the state. So I would think that the reservoirs should be capturing, but maybe the inflows are not near normal and not matching as much as they should be. Complete guess on my part. Maybe we can get an update from some providers or reservoir managers. Moving on into the Upper Rio Grande, where, as Peter mentioned, things over the course of the year have actually been quite positive, which has not typically been the case over the past 3, 4, 5 years. Snowpack is now at 81% of normal. Did get a little bit of bump, just a tiny bump out of this most recent set of storms. Not too much to write home about, but the real thing to write home about is that snowpack peaked out at 108% of normal in the Upper Rio Grande. That's great. It did peak out about a week or two before normal, but we should really be focusing on the fact that it was above normal. So that's great. We are seeing relatively high melt rates. I mean, they're not too high. Again, not worried about flooding or high flows, again, because of those low antecedent conditions. But for things to be a bit above normal and then to just switch real quick to inch plus melt rates across the entire basin, that is a little on the higher side. So hopefully snowpack doesn't melt out early in May. Hopefully it kind of tails out a little bit later in May to continue to provide some decent moisture to stream flows and soils. Looking at the individual sites, I think we might all kind of remember that the eastern and northern portion of the basin saw slightly better snowpack. This is the April snowpack measurements. I don't have the March one in here. So snowpack was a little bit better up there in the northern and eastern portion of the basin on the Sangres. However, in the southwest, things were a little bit below normal. However, compared to the rest of the state, snowpack is tracking a little bit closer to normal. So that's good. However, on the bad side, April precipitation here is 15% of normal so far. However, March was right at normal, so that's good. And then here you can see the month-to-date precipitation spatially, just not meeting the bar. Year-to-date precip in the Upper Rio Grande, 80% of normal, but quite dry through April. And then here we go, the streamflow forecast reflecting the above normal snowpack that we saw, but also taking into account those dry conditions and I would argue the very dry conditions that we've seen over the last summer, last year, and even I would argue the last 2 years. They're, like I said, it's worth reiterating that those dry conditions are really having a heavy effect on the streamflow forecast. Individual basins in the combined Rio Grande, and then the combined reservoir storage for the Rio Grande over the long term. If we look over the last 20 years, we could see that we're pretty much running right near the normal there. Unfortunately, we're not dipping down into some of these lower observations that we've seen over the last 20 years. Okay, moving on into our last sub-basin in the state, the Arkansas snowpack is at 85% of normal after peaking out at 102% of normal. It peaked out about a week or two early, and snowmelt rates are relatively near normal here. The Sangres did quite well. Sangre de Cristos, excuse me for abbreviating the name of that beautiful mountain range. This is as of last month. Snowpack was at 102% of normal, and we've seen a relatively quick melt off. But again, I wouldn't say it's too abnormal at 85. Snowpack is now at 85% of normal. Mainly with the southern portion of the basin doing slightly well for snowpack. Precipitation to date is 40% of normal, whereas March precipitation was 117. So that was good. And then here we can see the spatial representation of month-to-date precip. Not very good, but a little bit better than the all red spots that we've seen across the number of basins. Year-to-date precip, 87% of normal. You can see that we were very close to normal at the beginning of the month. We're probably arguably right at or 100% or maybe just a percent or two below, but we have dried out, unfortunately. And then here are those streamflow forecasts. We can probably assume that some of these streamflow forecasts will go down a little bit come May 1. And I'm sorry that I did not put any of the daily guidance forecasts in here. Sorry again that we're missing a few reservoirs. I can't remember why we don't have those here. But we do have the majority of the reservoirs for the basin, and those reservoirs are trending downward compared to the normal, which is the black line for the combined basin, or the combined reservoirs in the Arkansas. Okay, statewide summary. So for both snowpack and for the precipitation maps, I did roll back a few months. So here in February, snowpack was at 84% of normal. March and the magnanimous storm gave us a bump to 92% statewide. And unfortunately, we fallen another 15% since last month's presentation to now 77% of normal. Fortunately, the South Platte is at 96% of normal because of some of the more recent storms and the weather pattern that we've seen. But the rest of the state has seen some significant declines. Right now, as of yesterday morning, I'll consider that right now, snowpack is at 77% of normal, and statewide snowpack peaked out at 91% of normal just before April 1. So in general, pretty good, but as is typically the case in Colorado, the story is really quite different across much of the state, so you really have to zoom into each of the basins. Statewide precipitation through April, as of yesterday, is 38% of normal, and March was very close to normal at 103%. Month-to-date precip here, again, you can see by some of the non-red colors on the Front Range and parts of the Sangre de Cristos that there has been slightly better precipitation for the month of April so far on the eastern-facing mountains, but other than that, things are much below normal. Statewide precipitation to date is 78% of normal. And I would argue again that this little bump here is mainly driven by the South Platte and portions of the Arkansas and eastern facing mountains. So it's not, as Peter was pointing out, it's not affecting the western portion of the state. Here again, February 12th, we were statewide precipitation year to date was 76% of normal, bumped up to 83 in March, and then we're back down to 78% here as of yesterday morning statewide. Just some color representations of the streamflow forecast statewide, better in the eastern facing mountains, worse in the western. Statewide reservoir storage at 86% of normal. I think that's up 1% since last month. Better reservoirs in the northern basins and the southern basins are seeing, unfortunately, lower reservoir values. And here you can see that trend for all of the basins, all of the major basins in the state, and then statewide on the right, what's happened since the beginning of the water year. And here's the long-term trend for the combined reservoirs in Colorado, still below normal, as I mentioned earlier. Sorry, was unable to get the SWASIs for last month and this month. However, this is last month's surface water supply index for the individual basins. And then here is this month, a slight improvement from the March storms. But like I was saying, I would guess that for May 1, we're probably going to see a number of these SWASIs degrade in May 1. I think I've hit on a number of these things many times, so I won't reiterate a bunch of these. Reservoir storage is at 86% of normal, just up 1% since last month. But stream flows are up, so hopefully we will be capturing that runoff that we're seeing right now. And I think I'll just leave it at that and open it up to questions.
Who has questions for Brian? Not hearing anybody. Nicely done, Brian. Thank you for all that information.
Yeah, of course, Tracy. Thank you.
Just wanted to ask Tristay if she has any information or updates from the National Weather Service she wants to share with us. Okay. Not sure if Tristay's still with us. That's okay. Next thing up on our agenda is our water provider discussion. Jason from Denver Water has kindly agreed to start us off to talk about not only Denver Water's status, but also the status of some coordination efforts he's working on around the state. So if you could kick us off for this section, I appreciate it, Jason.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you very much. And as always, thanks to all the speakers. These meetings are incredibly helpful for me, I know, and I'm sure for everyone else. All right, so speaking on Denver Water's update, currently, of course, you guys might remember we get our water 50% from the Colorado River collection system and then 50% from the South Platte. And so right now on the Colorado River watershed, we're sitting at 84% of our normal. And that is kind of similar to what you saw earlier, where if you look back in April, we were closer to mid 90s, and now we're at 84% of normal. On the South Platte river watershed, we're at 96% of normal, so better, and that's due to the storms we've seen along the Front Range and just east of the Divide. Our reservoir levels right now at 77% of full. Normal this time of year would be 79% of full, so we're close to that. And we are projecting right now with the latest streamflow estimates that we'll be at a 92% full at peak. But we'll have to keep adjusting that as we see the streamflows come in. So that's Denver Water. I won't give individual updates, obviously, for the folks that are in our coordination meetings. Instead, I'll give you an idea of what those general meetings have been able to do. So as you guys might remember from last time when I was chatting about this, we Denver Water and Aurora partnered to start two coordination groups. One is a local focused Denver Aurora Metro Drought Coordination Group. It's made up of 26 water providers in the Denver Aurora Metro area. And then one level up, more regional, we created a Front Range Drought Coordination Group. This is made up from all the large metro areas, from Fort Collins down to Pueblo, and it also includes Northern Water. So these two groups meet monthly, and what we kind of discuss is what is everyone's thoughts on restrictions or drought or what's going on inside their collection system, since all of our systems are different. And that's been eye-opening to how our systems all relate and how dependent we are on each other to just kind of continue to do operations that we normally do. And it's been fascinating to see all of those all up and down the Front Range, not just the metro area. But what we also talk about is messaging, and I think we've been very successful here. In both coordination groups, we've been able to share the messaging and communications that our organizations are either thinking of putting out, have put out. Here's a press release we're thinking of. What is the group's thoughts? If we have an interview that we did, we put it out to everyone. Denver Water just put in their annual watering rules, which is 3 days a week watering. We do that every year. And we sent out that pamphlet or that information card to all of our partners. And then our partners sent back some of their information too. It's incredible how we've been able to coordinate those communication pieces. Some of the smaller water providers have taken the verbiage of the larger, some of the verbiage, and then also added on their own very local verbiage, which is excellent. In the past, what has happened is a lot of times Denver Water, Aurora Water, especially in the metro area, they dominate the news cycle, and their messages get out to the Front Range media, sometimes even to the Western Slope, and it's confusing. So this idea that we can have general messaging, that we all use the kind of similar strategic verbiage, but then everyone has their own local message, I think has helped out quite a bit for customers as well. So that is the update. We meet again. Metro Group meets in about a week and a half. Front Range Group meets in a month. And we'll have more information then as we discuss looking at drought and conditions.
Thanks, Jason. Trustee. Okay, I'm sorry. Trustee is having some trouble with her mic. I'm just trying to read her message here. Don't have anything. How much of a lag will there be between 91 and 2020 climate normals released and when they start showing up in your products? Thanks, Trustee. We do understand that that's a lot of effort to update the normals and then to include it in your products. So I hope that didn't sound like that I was getting impatient, but it's good to understand your timing. And Jason, something that you were saying, I guess, just makes me want to mention something like a public service announcement, maybe for the water providers, something you might all already be aware of. But I was listening last week to a luncheon webcast put on by the Colorado River District, and they had Senator Rankin speaking, and some of you might have seen this, but he was talking about the state's budget outlook. But one thing that he was talking about was not only stimulus funding coming to the state from the federal government this year and pretty soon, I believe, but also some stimulus funding that was going to be made available to Colorado local governments. And Jason, when you were talking about coordination and your systems being reliant on one another, I was thinking also about how some of the systems are impacted by the burn areas and the challenges with that. But in any case, thinking of all the challenges facing our water providers, I just wanted to mention what I understand is some stimulus funding that might be available for infrastructure type of work. So that's all. Otherwise, I just thought I would go in order of water providers based on when people put into the chat who they are and who they represent. And so the one I had first was Will Stambaugh from City of Golden, although I think I saw that Will has since left. So I'm going to move on maybe quickly from Will unless he speaks up. And Swithin, you were next from Centennial.
All right, for Highlands Ranch, our reservoirs are currently about 57%. This is about 25% lower than where we normally are this year, or this time of year. Demand-wise, we are seeing lower demands in April than typical. A lot, mostly due to the wet and cold weather. These freezing temperatures do a wonderful job of conserving water and keeping the HOAs from turning their irrigation systems on. Overall, I would say my outlook for this year's water supply is improving, due mostly to every snowstorm we've been able to pick up. Also here at Centennial, we were able to have the board pass at the end of March a drought response plan. So we now have that in the books, and so another tool that we can use to address these issues as they come up. But overall, I'm kind of a more positive outlook than a month ago.
Thank you, Suthan. All right, next person I had highlighted, Ken Curtis. Are you still on the phone? The call. All right. I'll move on if I don't hear folks speak up. Don't feel like you need to speak if you don't want to. And then if it was just a mic problem, you can speak back up later. Katie from Colorado Springs Utilities.
Good morning.
Morning.
So currently our demands in April are a little bit higher than normal that we see for this time of year, probably about by 2 or 3%. So nothing too crazy there. Currently in storage, we're right at about 71%, and this time of year we usually see just about 68%. So we're about 2% higher than normal for total storage, and that includes one of our reservoirs on Pikes Peak, Crystal Reservoir, that is currently down for some dam maintenance right now, so that's at 0. So we're still doing pretty good with our storage, considering we've got one of our big reservoirs offline at the moment. Our current snowpack on North Slope and South Slope is a little bit above normal at about 108, 111%. So I think those recent storms have really helped with that there. And then I think that's about all I have on my end.
Thank you. I think I saw Eric Jorgensen just left the call. Robbie Glenn, City of Boulder. All right. How about Chris Wolf from Eagle?
Sure, I can chime in really quick.
Thanks.
We are keeping our fingers crossed for some precipitation. We've been getting forecasts for snow. Got a little dusting yesterday, but every little bit helps. We've also had some days that were called for snow that have been absolutely beautiful. We do see that water use has gone down now that the resorts are fully closed in this valley, Vail, Beaver Creek, and Arrowhead. We are pushing forward with our drought response and really engaging our customers before the irrigation season begins, which hopefully is not too soon. Other than that, yeah, we're all kind of in the same place. So appreciate it.
Thank you. Robbie, saw your message about the mic. Just speak up if you're able to get it to work, and we'll just keep going down the line until then. Josh, are you with us from Westminster?
Hi, Tracy. This
Hi.
is Josh. You know, we're looking better and basically within kind of typical ranges for storage and probably a little bit below demand, but the recent storms from March and even this month have given us a little more positive outlook. We're still under a drought watch, which was implemented back at the beginning of March, but we're not looking to go any further at this point.
Sounds good. Okay, Laura Emerson, Water Association of the Rockies on the Big Thompson. Are you still with us? All right, how about Emily from Northern Water?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So Carter is at 93% full. Horsetooth is at 84% full. Granby is at 65%, and Willow Creek is at 77%. Our board set a 70% quota, which is the average year quota earlier this month at the board meeting, but they do plan to revisit that at the next month's board meeting. And we still plan to pump Windy Gap if it comes into priority. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. John Moore, City of Thornton.
Howdy, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, Thornton's overall storage, I lost it here, of course. Now I have it back. We're sitting at 71.3% of capacity, which is fairly normal for this time of year. And the ditches, some of the ditches are on, so life is good there. Our demand year to date is 2.05% below 2020. And let's see. Anyway, that's kind of where we're at. The wet weather has really been helping. We've been messaging our ratepayers about the drought, but the March magnanimous storm helped us out a lot and it changed our view about entering stage 1 drought restrictions. But last month, City Council did approve our permanent watering restrictions, which are 3 days a week, similar to other folks. So we're actually imposing restrictions we didn't have before for this drought. And let's see, always like Stanley Lake is sitting at 31,149 acre feet, which is about just under 73%. And Josh might correct me here, but so far I haven't heard anything from our operations folks that they're worried about Stanley Lake filling this year. So the streamflow forecast April 1 for Clear Creek was average, and that's nice to see. And that's my report.
John, out of curiosity, if your permanent restrictions are watering 3 days a week, then what would be different under, I think you said stage 1 or level 1 or some kind of elevated level of drought preparedness?
Well,
do you know?
Yes, no, sure. I understand the question. Our stage 1 in our new drought plan that we wrote this year is quite a broad range, and you're correct in that 3 days a week was part of the old drought plan, stage 1, and but of course that made it unnecessary. So our stage 1 now would add enforcement and patrolling and messaging, and actually we're putting, we've changed the fines and things like that. So enforcement would be the big part on a stage 1 drought declaration now, and then further restrictions down to 2 days a week are also part of that range. So does that answer your question?
It does. And I'm guessing that, the drought plan that Thornton put in place has restrictions probably similar to what other metro water providers' drought plans might also include. So I thought you might be an example of how that works generally across the metro area. Is that true, John?
I wouldn't know. Yeah, I can't answer that question. I live in Denver. I'm under the 3 days a week, but I don't believe unless, I don't really know how other water providers would sync up.
Okay. Well, thank you for explaining how it would work in Thornton then.
Hey, Tracy.
You're welcome.
Yes.
This is Robbie with City of Boulder. I finally got my microphone working.
All right. Well, thanks for working on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess from our end of the world, We have 2/3 of our water supply comes from Middle Boulder Creek and North Boulder Creek. Our storage in North Boulder Creek is sitting at 55%, which is average for us. Middle Boulder Creek is slightly below average, but that's because this winter we did a maintenance projects on a couple of our gates on the reservoir. So it's a little bit lower at 48%. Our snowpack in both watersheds are looking pretty good, as we've heard from the reports today. I think the snow-till site up at our university camp on North Boulder Creek is sitting at 98 or 97%. And then our streamflow forecasts are sitting about 94%. So we're looking pretty good compared to some areas of the state. The other third of our water does come from the upper Colorado with northern water, and that's kind of where we're at for right now. Our demands are slightly above normal. This weather has been a little crazy and chaotic though the past couple of weeks, so that's where we're sitting. Other than that, a couple other efforts that Jason kind of mentioned. We have been doing a joint press release with some North Metro area providers. Aaron Mesner with Broomfield has been kind of leading that effort. So we've been using that messaging to communicate out to our providers that on just the water conditions this year.
Okay, that sounds good. Any other water providers who want to give a report? Okay, Cindy Lair, if you're still with us, I wondered if you wanted to give any type of report about the agricultural community.
Can you hear me?
No, we hear you. Thanks, Cindy.
Oh, good. It took me a moment to get all the mutes off. So, hi everybody. I'm Cindy Lair with the Department of Agriculture, and I've spent a little bit of time recently traveling around in the Eastern Plains, and the dryland wheat farmers are extremely happy about this moisture. Hopefully it's timed well and they didn't go through too much dryness in February. But the irrigators, like on the Fort Lyon down in the lower Arkansas, they are really going through a hard time if they have pivots, because at 16 degrees down there last night, and a lot of frozen systems and holding on to water in their ponds. So they're really looking forward to turning things back on to get rid of the water, put it on the ground. But so that's kind of what's going on in southeastern Colorado. But the dryland farmers, I think, are pretty happy. And when I talk to people on the western slope, it's just like Peter and Brian's reports said earlier, it's just dry over there. And they got, I think, Delta County, I don't know if it was widespread, but they got rain, which was good, and we got snow last night. So that's about all I can report for right now.
Sounds good. I didn't see Joel on our call, so I don't know that we have any other ag reports. But is there anyone else on the call who would like to make any reports or make an announcement at all? Okay. Not hearing anybody. I think if there is no other information anyone wants to share, we can stand adjourned for today. And then, sorry, I did lose. We're seeing something different on your screen, Ben, but I assume we're meeting again next month. I can't quite see what that date says. Do you mind? Hopefully everybody, there it is, May 25th, 9:30 is our next meeting. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Ben, for running the show.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks. Bye-bye.